It's time to prepare for combat. Those were the words solemnly delivered by Defence Minister Judith Collins to a crowd of graduating Army recruits last week. And the message comes against a backdrop of rising global tensions, heightened enough for Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters to compare to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Judith agrees with Winston Peters. She told these recruits the world feels more unstable now than it has at any other point in her lifetime. So I found this quite interesting, Fran. What do you think? Is it time to prepare for combat? How much of a likelihood is this, do you think?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. I spent a bit of time up in the Netherlands and I was quite amazed at the preparations there, converting part of the port at Rotterdam for bringing in troops, bringing in ships, all of that. There was very much a sense that, post-NATO, people were definitely thinking that that war could spread on multiple fronts. So, I probably rate that more in the Middle East than actually the China thing, I have to say. And the Middle East situation, certainly when I was in Europe at that time when, Trump was throwing in, doing his ballistic missiles on the nuclear facilities, and then Tehran was busy spraying missiles back at Qatar, at the US base. I mean, that was quite deeply scary there, and then it all settled down. So I think, to me, it's sort of like, what is the one foul step that might trigger something, where people aren't prepared. So, no, I don't rule it out.
I'll come to you, Phil, very soon, but large powers arming up and where not, I think that was the quote, Corin, Dann, expect to see New Zealand's defence front and centre into the next year.
Yeah, well, I agree with Fran. I mean, the no question that the world is definitely more unsafe, and the risk is that there is a miscalculation by one of these great powers or some proxy or some other smaller nation, and that drags people in. And every time there is the Iran flare-up or something similar, the risk of that miscalculation grows, and that is a concern. I think that New Zealand troops always need to be trained for combat, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, that just stands to reason. If you're going into the army, especially our elite forces, they need to be able to fight. That's just, I just think that's a bottom line. I guess what the message sort of is being sent is that that's more likely now, and I think it certainly is, and perhaps Phil could pick the baton up here. It's not the benign strategic environment anymore, is it, Phil?
No, it certainly changed from early in the 21st century when we were living in a relatively benign strategic environment. We live in more uncertain and troubled times, there's no doubt about that. I was a little amused at the comments and the picture, which had Judith wearing a long coat and a fur hat. She looked like she was on the Russian front.
Very Russian.
Cold.
But, the immediate...
Very cold.
It was slightly Rambo-ish, because the immediate question you asked, training for combat with whom? Now, look, we've always trained our troops for combat. I happen to live next door to the SAS training ground, so I hear them training for combat every day, with the bullet, the sound of the bullets and the explosions. And you have to train your army for combat. But the real problem today, I think, is that as a small country, New Zealand has always relied on the rule of international law. That's what Peter Fraser did at the United Nations in 1945. Small countries need to have the rule of law rather than might being right. Today, we've got the Russians, of course, with their invasion and aggression against Ukraine that breached the fundamental principle of the Charter of the United Nations of non-aggression and respect for territorial integrity. We've got China, and I'm not paranoid about China, but China will do what all superpowers do. They'll act in their own interests. And, what they're doing in the South China Sea ignores the International Covenant on the Convention on the Rule of the Sea. Yeah. But now you've got Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, from the country that was right behind the international rule of law in 1945, is totally ignoring it. I mean, if China was saying what Trump was saying now, he's going to, if necessary, use military force to take over Greenland and the Panama Canal, we'd be up in arms. If China was using tariffs as economic coercion, and they have used it to a very smaller degree, would be up in arms.
Yeah.
But here's the leader of the so-called democratic and free world doing these things, pulling out his aid from the world, the richest country in the world. They've cut their aid by 90%. 3 million people will die because of that cut in aid. That has pulled his people out of UNICEF today, out of WHO. You've got in the United States that traditionally we've said they're a democratic country like ours, they're like-minded, we share the same values. I don't believe that the Trump administration is like-minded with New Zealand or shares our values.
And you got in trouble with it for your comments.
Oh,
and,
absolutely.
back,
and I have no regret for saying it. Somebody had to say it.
All right.